Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 17th of April. Today we're doing a brief update looking at the situation around Robotyne and then Krasnohorivka, the northern section of the Avdiivka front, and then Chasiv Yar. Let's begin by looking at a minor change that occurred within Robotyne. So we have this video that came out today showing a Russian armored vehicle, and it advanced from its original positions that were likely around Novoprokopivka. It made its way across open fields going past this fortification system located south of Robotyne, which is partially under Russian control and partially in the gray zone, I believe. And then from there, it made its way into the village center, crossed through some of the roads, and then landed troops within this particular housing area, which is pretty up north relative to the previous Russian line. And so if we're measuring the advance itself, it amounts to about 400 meters north. And at that point, you had a Ukrainian counterattack where they organized some forces, some infantry. I believe it would be from the 65th Mechanized Brigade, and they tried repelling the Russian advance, targeting the infantry that had dismounted within these houses. And so there was a firefight. The Russian side, they released their perspective of things, showing that they were targeting the specific Ukrainian elements sent to the line of contact with FPV drones and artillery. And so the Russian side, they claim that they've been able to maintain their current gains. And really, this comes after 9 days where we've seen a gradual uptick in the Russian pressure on Robotyne, and also to a lesser extent around this area just to the northwest of Verbove. Now moving on to Krasnohorivka, we're going to cover a video that was released today, which is extremely interesting and gives us an idea of the general state of affairs within this part of the battlefield. And so really for over a week now, we've been aware of the fact that the Russians in certain sectors of the front line, but especially around Krasnohorivka, they've been taking most likely T-72s, but probably also other Russian tanks like T-80s or T-90s, and modifying them with this all-encompassing metal framework. And this gives them protection from almost the entirety of the tank, especially at the top and on the sides. And then on the rear, there's even more protection with additional sheets of metal. And that's specifically to protect where the engine is located. And so we've seen this now being utilized on this part of the front line, especially in assaults through open fields for over a week. And it's mostly in order to protect the vehicle. At this point, usually it's tanks from drones or from general enemy fire. It could be potentially from ATGMs. I haven't seen how the metal framework resists ATGMs, so it's going to be very interesting to see how that pans out. But definitely it would resist either drones that drop grenades or direct FPV drone hits. And in terms of the way that it looks like, it's being described as a turtle, and it does remind me in terms of its shape to the ironclads from the Civil War, those warships that the Confederacy used. But anyhow, when looking at their utilization, they do have a lot of benefits when it comes to the protection that they afford, especially when assaulting an area where there may be very high drone coverage or infantry that are surrounding you from all sides, or potentially armored vehicles are attacking you. And then in terms of some of the downsides, of course, there's always a downside when looking at any sort of new modification, but it is really just the reality of war that as we have experiences and as the battlefield develops over months and years, that there will be new designs and new improvisations that lead to new sorts of technology or a return to previous technologies. And so in this case, some of the downsides would be, first of all, that of course the turret can't really turn the full 360 degrees. It could really only fire to the front and get a view of what's in front of it. And then also it severely restricts the exit passageways for the crew that are located within the tank. And so if there actually would be some sort of destruction from an FPV drone, then it would be much harder for the troops to get out. And of course, it would also be sealed inside. And so there could be issues with breathing and all of that. But all in all, we could see how it's being used to the detriment of the Ukrainians on this particular battlefield because of the video that was released today, where we see that this tank, and along with one other tank, so there were two tanks involved. The leading tank was a tank with the metal modification, and so it was advancing along this open field. Again, no idea if there were mines because we didn't see any sort of explosions caused by them. So it seems like any sort of issues with mines have been dealt with in this particular area, but there was Ukrainian shelling, specifically using cluster munitions targeting those two tanks, but it had no effect on them either because it missed or because it was resistant to those shells. And so it made its way into the southernmost residential district of Krasnohorivka, this tank, and then it made it like in this sort of like left turn and actually entered within the rail station, and that's now become the epicenter of fighting. And this was again verified on the 16th of April by video from the Ukrainian side showing a HIMARS strike on what they purported to be Russian infantry stationed within the rail station. And so we definitely know the Russians are present over here. And the tank itself actually, it advanced several hundred meters west towards this other structure next to the rail station and dismounted troops over there. And so again, we're seeing additional landings of forward Russian assault forces within this part of Krasnohorivka. And then from there, it made a turn out of the rail station and advanced even further north, and then took another left turn into the industrial facilities of Krasnohorivka. And this is an area that was imagined to be highly fortified by the Ukrainians, an area where they would have numerous firing positions to target any sort of Russian advance that could reach that area upon a first contact. But even alone, because one of the tanks that was accompanying the modified tank, it did not make it all the way to here. It probably stopped further south. But this particular tank with the modifications, it actually made its way all alone in the open without being fired upon by any sort of drone, without being fired upon by any sort of Ukrainian SMARM spy or ATGMs, none of that. And so it was able to make its way basically 1 kilometer to the northeast, all the way to this very important Ukrainian stronghold in the region. And at that point, it turned back. But it does show you that this area is lacking in Ukrainian forces that are at ground zero. Of course, there are Ukrainian troops that have been moved in several minutes after Russians launch assaults from other parts of Krasnohorivka, probably further to the north. We saw that, for instance, when the Russian forces first entered into Krasnohorivka a couple of days ago on April 9th. The Ukrainians did move in vehicles to counterattack, but it shows you that on the specific line of contact over here, the Ukrainians, after months of attrition, after months, I guess you could say starting in the beginning of this year, that's when the Russians really, they ramped up their firepower, their usage of FABs, usage of artillery drones on Krasnohorivka. And despite the fact that reinforcements have been sent in from several brigades, including Azov and the 80th Brigade, to this town, that has not been enough to fully make sure that this entire town is protected. And so it does raise questions about the fact that there may be a lack of infantry in some key parts of this specific part of the battlefield, which allows for gaps to be formed and then for the Russians to take advantage of that using their armored assaults. And now this really does it really paves a way for additional assaults that could exploit this Ukrainian weakness and get control over additional parts of the town. And it also puts into question whether there are even any Ukrainian forces left in the southernmost section of Krasnohorivka. And this is very interesting because really the reason why the Russians were able to afford to penetrate through this sector is because they were able to push through the rail line. And this is in the eastern side of Krasnohorivka, the area that is supposed to be the most fortified. But nonetheless, even though the Russians did suffer some material damages, it is much less than in some other battles. And really the Russians have only been going at full force in Krasnohorivka for 3 to 4 weeks. And so in terms of comparing it to other Ukrainian fortifications, this really the beginning of this battle, the beginning of the urban part of this battle did start relatively quickly, given the size and the amount of time the Ukrainians had to fortify this part of the front line. And it's also interesting to see that the Russians were able to make their initial breach through the eastern section and not directly from the south. Now, a bit further to the north, to the south of Pervomaiska in particular, you could see that there is a salient that was formed due to the Russian capture, first of all, of Nevelske. It's about a month ago by now. And then about a week ago, the capture of Pervomaiska. And so there is a question about whether there are any Ukrainian infantrymen still located over here. Given some of the shortages and patches in the front line that I talked about in an even more important area like Krasnohorivka, it is certainly possible that the Ukrainian squads were forced to withdraw westwards in order to shorten the front line and to prevent any sort of encirclement. And so we don't know if there are Ukrainian forces over here, But the Russian side, they are reporting that they're now beginning combing operations, taking over the trenches that were set up by the Ukrainians over here. And so we'll get further verification of that in the coming days. So for now, just keep an eye out for this. I guess if we measure the distance, it's like a 5 kilometer wide strip of open fields that are located to the south of Netalove. And then going a bit to the north, this is now where we get to actual changes that occurred on the 15th and 16th of April. And so, of course, for a week now, we've known that the Russian forces were able to enter Semenivka. And despite the fact that, again, they're crossing over very narrow passes of land, you could see it over here, two particular routes they crossed over the Drina River from. Despite that fact, the Ukrainians were unable to muster the forces to conduct a localized counterattack and push them several hundred meters eastwards back across the river. And so the Russian forces, of course, exploited their positions in the southern trenches and houses and pushed further north along this main road. And now we have this video showing that there was actually a certain Ukrainian defensive response. And we see that they have drones that dropped grenades onto Russian positions, first in trenches that are located further south, and then within houses that are located in the central section of Semenivka. Again, those drones, they definitely did yield damage to the Russian side, so there were several Russian infantrymen that were killed by those drones. We could see it in the trenches and in the houses, but nonetheless, it does confirm that the Russians do have a presence over here. So now there is ambiguity as to whether the Ukrainians even have control over the northern section of Semenivka. That's still unknown at the moment. So for the most part, whatever sort of battalions are still located near the line of contact, they're for the most part being stationed in villages further westwards or in this ridge area that is overlooking the Drina River Valley and the Russian positions that are now being taken. The Russians are now taking over within Semenivka and within Berdychi. And speaking of Berdychi, by the end of the 15th of April, we did receive information from Deep State, so a pro-Ukrainian source, that there was a further Russian advance to the north of the town. What we saw was previously, when I talked about in my last video, is that the Russian forces were able to gain a foothold within the Zarya dachas. So this is like an agricultural community, and there are various tree lines over there used as concealment for the advancing forces. So the front line looked something like this, where the Russian forces were trying to push further westwards along this tree line to get control over the heights that overlook Berdychi, but also to a certain extent Novobakhmutivka over here. And so the Russians were, first of all, able to get additional control of fields to the west of the Zarya compound area. And then from there, they pushed further to the northwest along the rail line and got control of the entirety of the Zarya dachas. And so in terms of the advance, in total, it will be a 1.5 kilometer advance to the northwest. And now the Russians are extremely close to Ocheretyne. In terms of the latest information, actually right before I made this video, by the end of April 16th, Deep State, they changed their mapping to indicate that the Russian forces had actually penetrated even deeper and gotten in control of trenches that are located right to the southeast of Ocheretyne, and that now the Russians are directly on the outskirts of the town, with basically no distance between the Russian forces' forward echelons and the town itself. If that turns out to be true, that would be extremely concerning, because it would show that in a matter of days, the Russian forces were able to penetrate the Ukrainian line in an area that was previously thought to be rather strong in terms of the reinforcements that were moved in and the equipment that was moved to hold the line. If we look at the troop compositions, you have the 47th Mechanized Brigade, one of Ukraine's strongest units defending over here, and they were supplemented by the 68th Jaeger Brigade, which is located over here. It was moved recently from the Luhansk front. And then only about a week plus ago, you had the 115th Mechanized Brigade, a unit that has not seen fighting since Bakhmut, be moved into the front line for the first time in such a extended period. And they were specifically blamed by Deep State for this Russian, I guess, break in the lines, which allowed them to reach Ocheretyne. And so, according to Deep State, this lack of cohesiveness, this lack of defensive capacity displayed by this unit is responsible for the Russian advance, in that it actually surprised the 47th and the 68th that are also holding in the sector. And I guess it can make sense if the 115th was never fully replenished and if it never received the same stock with the same experience that it had previously when it's fighting in Bakhmut. and it now has faced the realities of the war again for the first time in a long time. That could just be some of the explanation. But all in all, these Russian advances actually make a lot of sense when you look at the topographical map. The Russian advances have occurred along the rail line, and that rail line is located on pretty high elevation in comparison to the surrounding fields. And it is comparable to the fields which the Russians are now taking over to the north of Berdychi along this vector, which are on similar elevation to the Ukrainian positions in Ocheretyne. Ocheretyne, as I've repeated for months now, is the prevailing height that the Ukrainians have that is located to the west of Avdiivka now that they've lost that city. And so Charitina, that's again, it's an organizing hub, forward logistical center for the Ukrainian side. Now it's not really being utilized for logistics or for artillery because of how close the Russians are to it. But then again, it is a position on a ridge which the Russians, if they were to take it over, would give them the opportunity to overlook the entirety of the Ukrainian positions and potential fallback lines located to the east of the Vavcha River. The Vavcha River is located around here. And so that would put the northern flank of the Vavcha River defenses and, of course, any sort of Ukrainian troop that is stranded in these fields in a very exposed position. And in the long term, it would mean that eventually the Ukrainians would be pushed out due to the Russian control over Ocheretyne. And that's why the Russians, they want to go for the section first. That's why they've shifted focus away from directly assaulting an area like Umanske or Semenivka, although we've seen gains over there, and have now put a particular emphasis on the situation in Ocheretyne. And so looking forward, what I'm interested in is seeing whether the Russian forces try to consolidate control over the fields located south of Ocheretyne in order to get full control of the southern flank and of all of the heights in that region, or whether they try to get control of this flank to the east of Ocheretyne, which includes various Ukrainian defensive nodes in Keramik and Novokalinove, that at least on paper are supposed to have good defenses with trenches and brigades that were moved in at the beginning of the Avdiivka offensive. Now have been located there for 6 months. So we'll have to see which route the Russians decide to choose. And lastly, on the 15th of April, we received a minor change in the front line in the Chasiv Yar sector, according to deep states. So we did have an adjustment of the Russian lines just in this tree line just to the east of the Canal district over here, indicating the Russian forces slightly pushed to the west. And then deep state also conceded that for the most part, the Russian forces have control over the forest patch that is located to the northeast of the Canal district, and that the Ukrainians are gradually retreating further westwards and westwards away from the dachas located to the north of said district. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.